Welcome to the Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Matt Moore, and today I'm joined by Action Network Director of Research, Evan Abrams, for a gambling guide to the NFL 2025 Super Bowl. Today we're going to go through some trends from Evan and discuss a few things that'll be on the top of every football bettor's mind in the coming weeks leading up to the Super Bowl. Evan, how's it going, man?
Dude, it's fantastic. I love this time of year. I mean, forget the Super Bowl, but you got March Madness around the corner. And I love analyzing just two teams. Because once you get to this point, you can dive so much deeper on so much stuff. So just fantastic. Can't wait.
All right. Well, despite the fact that I am, in fact, a fan of the reigning, defending, two-time champions of the world, your Kansas City Chiefs, we're going to keep it even keel on this one and talk about this one as objectively as possible as the Chiefs are set to take on Saquon, Barkley, I guess also Jalen Hurts, and the Philadelphia Eagles, and one of the best rosters in the NFL. For the second time in 3 years, it's sure to be a classic. Before we dive into these trends, quick programming note, okay? People want to know when we're dropping our Super Bowl props, okay, from our predictive analytics guys like Sean Kerner, Nick Giffen, Chris Raybon, because those guys have hit at just an obscene rate in the last few Super Bowls. We're doing these as two sets of Wednesday live shows, all right? Try to catch these lives as the numbers, they get crushed immediately. Like the guys put these things out and I'm always like, oh, I got a notification from Sean and it's gone. Because I helped my daughter get out of the car. Not helped her with her homework, just like, hey, let me get the door for you. Oh, the number's gone, and that's it. It's over. We'll be going live on the Action Network YouTube channel, youtube.com/The Action Network, and on Twitter at Action Network HQ, Wednesday, January 29th, and Wednesday, February 5th, okay? We're going to do a part 1 at 4 p.m. Eastern with Nick Giffen and Grant Never, and then part 2 with Chris Raybon and Sean Kerner at 6 p.m. Eastern. So mark your calendars, Super Bowl props live shows next 2 Wednesdays, 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern, Action Network YouTube page, and at Action Network HQ on Twitter. All right, let's get into this, Evan. Where do you want to start, man?
How could you not start with Pat? The entire Super Bowl and the entire 2 weeks are going to be just so much about Mahomes. And honestly, it's what he's done, what he could do with a win here, the three-peat. That is going to be the topic of the conversation. And I think might lead to some line movement later in the week, maybe not. We'll see about that. But I think it's like from like a stats point of view, when you take Mahomes off the road, when that's like home or neutral site games, the numbers just feel absolutely made up. So like in January and February, Mahomes is 16-2 straight up in home or neutral site games, with his losses coming against just Burrow and Brady. He's 44-6 in that spot in November or later. In playoff games, he's 8-0 straight up and against the spread when either an underdog or a favorite of less than a field goal. On extended rest, which is Mahomes, but I think it's also Andy Reid, since he's had tons of success with Philly in that spot and then has kind of brought that over. There's a crazy stat. It's not even in here, but I believe with Mahomes and McNabb, he's like 26-3 or something like that on extended rest. Jeez. Something crazy. But on extended rest with Mahomes during the season, Mahomes is 30-4 straight up since 2019. The QBs to beat him are Brady, Matt Ryan, Jalen Hurts, and Aiden O'Connell, which some confusing names there, but 30-4 is probably where the focus should be. And I want you to comment on all of these, but I got 2 more, and then we can kind of go back for a second here. So Mahomes is 17-3 straight up, 85% in his playoff career, blanket career playoffs. 85% win percentage, is second best, minimum 10 starts since 1950, behind just Bart Starr, who is 9-1 in his playoff career. So basically, I mean, you're comparing him to who the trophies are named after. So that feels like every stat is kind of it's him and Lombardi or him and Hallis, and it just, that's kind of where we end up. And then the last one, and to me, I mean, you take straight up and against the spread as 2 separate things. Usually, obviously, when the spread is really small, money line becomes just as important. But this one is just stupid. On the road or neutral site, Mahomes has started 26 games either as an underdog or a favorite of 3 points or less, regular season and playoffs, his entire career. He's 21-4-1 against the spread in those games. That's 84%. So, I mean, all up and down here. I mean, the numbers are stupid. What I think gives him like the title of the Grim Reaper, which people talk about, is the fact that a lot of these numbers, when you talk away from home, is just absolutely, it's mind numbing to see how many times he beats people in other people's buildings, or in this situation, just a neutral site, which he's 5-0. But take whatever you want here, Matt. Dissect it, hit it, give it back. What do you got?
So I think like the interesting question when it comes to some of this stuff is, listener of the favorites constantly and listener of the Action Network podcast, I'm well versed in these numbers as far as how good Mahomes is as a 3-point favorite or an underdog. The question I think kind of here is, how do we keep winding up in spots where, when the Chiefs have played so many close games the past 2 years, like this has not been an impressive dominant run, which, by the way, I would mention what happens if they do have a dominant run in coming years. But this has not been a dominant team the last 2 seasons, and yet they win all these close games over and over and over again, which in part, it feeds into this complicated kind of matrix that we have, where it's like you can't power rate them that highly because their metrics, they're not winning by margin. So they're not racking up huge yard advantages. Their YPP is not going to be out of this world. Mahomes' numbers this season were pedestrian at best, at least until the last probably 6 games of the season. And yet they're consistently beating these numbers, right? Which is, I think it's pretty fascinating that I would wager to bet that before the playoffs, even 5 weeks ago, that the gap on these two teams in power rating would not have landed on Chiefs as a favorite. And in any other case in that situation, you would have to be like, well, if I'm getting, they're laying 1.5 and the Eagles are power rated higher, they're inherently should be a favorite on neutral, which is why, like, I'm very curious about your thoughts on the number. About, do you think this number is just like a base power rating based off an upgrade for playoffs, etc., or is this just like the books being like, we know if we put him as a dog, we're going to get absolutely hammered and it's going to be way too uneven, even if the sharps are come back in on the Eagles, and we can take a little bit off of that by making them this number of favorite? Like, what's your thought on the number when you look at these type of figures that you've got on the trends and where this number pops out to?
I mean, it can't go 2 points either way, in my opinion. And I think it's 2 points KC's way because, well, I mean, think about this. Philadelphia just scored 55 points in the conference championship, most points ever for any team entering a Super Bowl. And they're listed as an underdog. Like, I this was kind of proposed earlier, but I wonder how many of I think there's 10 teams, 11 with Philly, who've scored 40 plus in the conference championship. I wonder how many of those 11 teams were underdogs in the Super Bowl, because you assume off of that type of performance, hard to try to take the other side. And now you're thinking about last year's Super Bowl, where, I mean, it was basically Mahomes against the Avengers. I mean, that was the way it was built up. I mean, San Francisco had so much talent and so many players, and up and down. Whenever anyone was like, I like San Francisco in this game, you started listing position groups and players, and you're like, oh, well, this is the better team. This year, I think it's a little bit more even. Like, I think KC does an okay job kind of in each of the position group categories, but I think Philly is better in most of them. And I think up and down, it's dynasty versus Avengers kind of again in some way, shape, or form. And I think we made the Avengers favorites last year. Mahomes won. So I think this year it's like, okay, we'll go 1.5 this way. But I just don't think in this scenario, and also these two teams haven't played, so we haven't seen these versions against each other. Maybe that would have had an impact. But I think it's dynasty laying 1.5 against an Avengers type. And again, the weird thing about it is Hurts, from a passing point of view, hasn't even been close to an Avenger. He's not a part of the team at this point. It's the running game and the defense, which has done almost all of the work for Philly. Now, it looked better in the Washington game, but maybe that says more against Washington about Washington's defense than it does against KC and what they're going to put forward here. The one stat I'll give you before I toss it back, which kind of told me something because I was curious. So I was looking at Mahomes versus pass defenses 200 yards or less. So basically, these really good Philly pass defenses, like they're at 180 range, including the playoffs, I think. So he's 23-3 straight up career versus teams 200 yards or less pass defense. 12 straight wins. Last loss October of 2022 against Buffalo. The crazier note to me is I said, okay, well, a pass defense who allows 200 yards per game or less in September or October means nothing because you haven't faced enough teams. He's 12-0 in November or later with that stat. And that to me is the one where I say to myself, okay, well, maybe it doesn't matter how good Philly's pass defense is. I mean, he's going to play the game he's going to play, and he's going to have 2 weeks to do it. The craziest thing is, I don't know if you saw this tweet, but basically Greg Rousseau from Buffalo said that KC was running plays this weekend that they hadn't seen on film. Like, I truly believe maybe the Super Bowl 2 years ago doesn't mean anything. Like, maybe there is an entire new game plan here from Andy Reid and Mahomes to kind of just give Philly something that they can't study. And I think that's the worry. Like, that scramble that we talked in the Buffalo game was just not something that they'd ever seen before. So I think that is the worry here, and that is the worry with rest.
I said that almost immediately when they started running those RPOs on the first drive. I was like, I've watched every single Chiefs snap this year, and I was like, what is this? Where did this come from? Like, he hasn't been hitting those slants at an RPO all year, and then bam, 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 all the way down the field. It is wild also that I have consumed so much Chiefs content, and yet those stats that you listed still floor me, where I'm like, what? That's crazy. I think I've talked about a lot about this with Brandon Anderson too, about my belief on Mahomes is essentially, I think there are certain quarterbacks who excel in particular in high leverage situations. And that's like 3rd down and 6 or more, right? Like, who can complete those kinds of plays? Because most of the analytics models are going to ascribe a lot of that as luck based, because over the wide swath of time, it's like, well, you're not going to be successful ultimately in those because we have this huge sample of every other human. But if you specifically are good in those environments, and I would actually say CJ Stroud very much fits into the category of guys that are good in those set categories, which is why I have amount of fear for CJ Stroud. I think that's part of why these like small spreads, it's like, all right, if you're inside of it's not a coin flip, right? It's 55-45, but it is within this margin where that's what you're talking about as far as a band. And if you're able to stretch that anywhere considerably, it turns this from what is not a coin flip, but a slight advantage into a significantly more, despite the fact that you're not stretching it beyond the boundary of like 2-score games. So he wins all these 1-score games, but he wins 1-score games that are expected to be 1/2-score games. And that to me is maybe like how this kind of construct comes out. If we try and put some sort of analysis to these trends other than just being like, you should bet Mahomes as less than a 3-point favorite.
I mean, I think I'll say 2 things. We talk about Mahomes and these tight spreads, and it's the numbers are there. I mean, from Jalen Hurts' point of view, with a spread of 4 points or less either way, so -4 to +4, he's 13-9 road neutral and 9-4 over the last 2 seasons. So, I mean, not terrible numbers, not like he's, not showing up in these games that he should win in certain circumstances. And 9-4 last 2 seasons, I think is pretty good and probably, puts him up there if I had to look at the leaderboard. The other note I'll say is this. With Mahomes, at least from what we've seen up to this point, and it's the reason why it's probably just dumb at this point to list him as an underdog. So since 2018 in the playoffs, teams trailing -1 to -8, so 1 possession entering the 4th quarter or overtime. Chiefs have had 12 drives. So with Mahomes, 2018 playoffs, down 1 possession, 4th quarter overtime, 12 drives. They've scored on 11 of them. But when you talk about the other teams on that list, so just if you sort it since 2018 by number of scores, so the Rams are second, 5 of 13. The Bills are 4 of 10. The Eagles of 2 of 9, Patriots are 2 of 5, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. To me, it's just, you can't do anything, and you can't do anything but list them as a favorite in this spot because they've just shown you so many times that they come back or they hold the lead or they ice the game. I mean, there's just so many different circumstances, but that 11 of 12 is just, it's stupid.
It just is. That is. And it's why I think it's so frustrating, I think, because Simon said this about the models, right? On the favorites is like, how do you not model them lower based off of the fact that like everyone's like, he can't keep getting away with this. Like you should not be able to continue this because it should ultimately come down to like, this has to be noise or variance or luck. You can't be this consistently good in things that are this tight. And that I think is something you have to decide as a bettor is whatever it is that you believe in, whatever that variable is that equates the gap between expected result and how good he is in these scenarios is what should guide your bet. You mentioned the Avengers. Well, I'll tell you, Saquon Barkley is the Hulk and Thor and Iron Man and Captain America. Sure, Black Widow too. Let's just throw her in there as well. Absolutely ridiculous. Tell me some stats about Saquon.
So looking specifically at Saquon, and I think and I was trying to think about this when entering like this mind process of Philly versus KC. How could you quantify the rusher of Saquon's ability in this type of game, or even how many times has a rusher like him made this game? So he's the 11th running back to make the Super Bowl after rushing for 1,500 yards plus that season. I think that's, I mean, of those other 10 teams, 8-2 straight up. So off the bat, sounds pretty good. The two losses, Sean Alexander in 2005, Jamal Anderson in 1998. So, I mean, it does happen. I think the interesting part is when you talk about his rushing prop. So I believe last time I looked, it was 112 to 115 range. And last week, it got up to 130. He finished, I think he closed 124 range and finished under that. But in a Super Bowl, we haven't seen a running back go for 120 plus since Michael Pittman in 2003.
Whew, there's a name.
So, I mean, listen, it's been a while since someone exploded in that game. It was crazy to even look that up and say to myself, well, it's crazy we haven't seen someone in that distance do that. But I wanted to kind of take this to one other level with Saquon because I was curious. So of those 10 running backs that went for 1,500 plus yards, how many of those teams with that running back had any Super Bowl experience? And then I went further. So you've got Sirianni and Hurts, 2024 Eagles. They went to the Super Bowl 2 years prior. So they're going to be number one in this process. When you keep going back, 2004, Corey Dillon went for 1,500. Belichick and Brady won the year prior. They had experience. They won the Super Bowl that year with Dillon. You keep going back, 1998, Shanahan and Elway. They had Terrell Davis. They won the year prior in 98. They won in 97. They won in 98 as well. 1988, you've got Roger Craig, who runs for 1,500 plus yards. You've got Walsh and Montana. They had won twice prior. They win in 88 as well. So to me, I think the experience for the team going through this process and adding Saquon Barkley, who I think it was Miles Sanders, who was the running back in the previous Super Bowl. It's a massive upgrade. Now, there's other parts to the game, but I was trying to figure out, like, how do you quantify having the experience of being here while also adding such a massive piece, whether it's in the offseason or maybe the running back had been with you for a while and was having a great season. But to me, that's kind of interesting. Now, an incredibly small sample size and just one layer of the game, but that's the way I looked at it.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you brought these kind of numbers because, like, several of these won the year prior, right? Like, it's back-to-back appearances. But I also think that that's notable because it's kind of like, look, the Eagles did have a second half, fourth quarter lead over the Chiefs the last time that they played. Like, they didn't get smoked by Kansas City. And now they have the most dominant rushing force that we've seen in years, where the stat site I love most for the NFL, RBSDM, running backs still don't matter. I'm kind of like, you might need to change the name to like running backs except for Saquon Barkley still don't matter. Like, that's how dominant he's been this year. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then like, there's that part of me where it's like, if you ask me like as a Chiefs fan, like, hey, how are you going to stop him? I'm like, I have no idea. No clue. Probably won't. Probably have to outscore him. I don't know. Because it's such a dominant performance. And like, I do kind of wonder if, again, I always look at these things from the perspective of the models that drive betting behavior from the sharp groups in contrast to how the lines are set, right? How much of that is like, is there still kind of, because of the running back stigma, if there's a little bit of maybe a lag in properly rating Philly because of this? Because you look back, their wins in these 3 playoff games driven almost entirely, right, offensively at least, by Saquon, where it's just, first play from scrimmage, he's gone. So that to me is kind of the question here, is like, is there a capacity here for market evaluations and this trend to kind of like reflect that, right? Where it's like, look, if you have a running back this good and you're good enough and your quarterback's good enough for you to reach the Super Bowl, you're in a pretty good spot.
He's second in MVP odds. So I thought that was something else I wanted to look up this week before I put my article out next week, which I'll have like updated numbers and Gatorade and all the fun stuff in it. But I wanted to look at, when was the last time you had a player rated over the quarterback, and how many times in history has that happened? Because Saquon right now, second MVP with Jalen Hurts third, I think is kind of telling. And also, Saquon's minus 200 anytime touchdown. Plus, they're telling you he's going to rush for like $120 or so based off of the over/under, and they're underdogs in the game. So it's an interesting equation in terms of the matchup, and I think how scared everyone is of the Grim Reaper on the other side. It's weird because Philly has all these signs of a relatively dominant favorite in this game, and then you just have the experience on the other side. The fourth quarter, it doesn't matter what the score is; we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Alongside whatever folks feel are other factors that might contribute to Chiefs wins. You mentioned this earlier: the Eagles putting up 55 points in the conference championship. Personally, love to see that as a Chiefs fan. I love to see it because I want these gaudy performances in the NBA. There's nothing I like better than fading a team that hits 25 or more threes in a game in the very next time that they go out. If they score 140, that to me is like, oh, baby, let's go. This is a great time to come back the other way. But I am kind of curious. All right, we've got this dominant performance by the Eagles in the NFC champ. Like, that's a huge game. What does history kind of tell us about this level of dominance?
Yeah, so top 3 scorers in terms of points in the conference championship would be the Eagles at the top, but then you had the Panthers in 2015-16, and then the Bills in 90-91 scoring more than 45 points in the conference championship. Both those teams did lose in the Super Bowl. I think it's interesting, though, to kind of take a step back. Even teams to score 40-plus conference championship, 3-7 in the Super Bowl. So I do think usually, and this was something I think I want to put in the article for when I do it next week, but I wonder how many of those teams, again, closed as underdogs in that game, because you usually really see inflation, especially with this much time for the public to bet, on the team who just scored 55 freaking points. But now that team who just scored 55 points is actually getting points in this game, which feels like a little bit of an outlier in the data set. And I'm interested in looking at that. I'll take it 2 steps further, and then I'll toss it back to you. So number 1, again, just curious, 40-plus points in conference championship and no turnovers. And that's no turnovers in the playoffs leading to the Super Bowl. That would be 2024-25 Eagles. The Falcons did that in that 2017 season, and then the 05 Patriots. So those are the 3 teams really in terms of absolutely no turnovers, pretty much dominant games. Atlanta did lead 28-3 in that Super Bowl. They did lose, but it's still a pretty dominant performance. If you could tell me I bet Philly and they were up 28-3, I'd take that. And then New England in 05 ironically beats Philly in the Super Bowl. So that's a circumstance there. I have one more, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that they're 3-7 straight up in the Super Bowl and they score 40 plus points, right? Like, that to me is like really crazy. I think the turnover stuff, I think, honestly, I'd be very interested to get Stucky's thoughts on it. You can listen to the Action Network podcast and his Super Bowl preview with Six Pack to kind of get the views on that. But like, I'm very curious about the turnover kind of expectation stuff here. Whenever you have this kind of like last week, right? The Chiefs, like the Bills recover, I think, 150 of their own fumbles, if I recall correctly. And, Mahomes loses the one, and it was like, that could be a really killer one. And turnovers have usually are such a big turning point in these games. And there's a reason that the luck is always kind of ascribed to those things. But again, like, that's kind of the margin here is like, can you create it? And then there's probably also like a capacity here for thinking about which defense is more likely to create turnovers, which I think is like the Chiefs have struggled to create turnovers this year. They just haven't been great in that department. Meanwhile, since the Eagles defensive line was crafted in hell and brought forth to destroy all of us, they're pretty good at creating havoc. So I'd be curious to hear about havoc rates and those kind of things. But I do think that overall, if you told me how do teams that scored 40 plus points in the conference championship do in the Super Bowl, my gut instinct would have been, it's got to be the other way. There's always kind of a regression point. So that 3-7 straight up in the Super Bowl, that to me is kind of, it matches what I would expect based off of experience, less so than kind of the common sense. Oh, they're dominant. They do pretty well. So I think it's interesting. Go ahead and go one step further for me.
Yeah, so the Eagles have won 6 straight games entering the Super Bowl. Overall teams entering the Super Bowl on a 5+ game winning streak, 9-6 ATS since 2003. But more importantly, when their opponent isn't on that type of streak, entering the Super Bowl, they're actually 6-3 ATS with them covering 4 in a row. Now, you just saw the Chiefs do it twice because they did it in 22 and 23 seasons. The Bucs did it in that 2021 season, then the Chiefs again in 1920. So it's just right now the Chiefs aren't streaking because they decided to lose in week 18 against Denver and get absolutely annihilated. The difference there, I'm not really sure. The Eagles are playing really well. They're mostly blowing people out in this circumstance. Again, I think it's last 6 games, they're 15-0 in the turnover margin. They're on an absolute other planet right now. In terms of KC, which came into play last week, I think they're 25-19 when they lose the turnover battle with in the last few seasons. So, both directions, I can see how it doesn't really matter, but I like Philly's momentum in this circumstance. It just feels like Hurts isn't even playing fantastic, but as a team, they're playing their best. So it's almost like the opportunity to put it together in this type of game. And you talk about turnover luck. That fumble from Hurts in the last Super Bowl feels like it's not something that would be repeatable. And without that happening, I'm not sure KC comes back and wins that game. So I thought that's kind of interesting.
You don't happen to have any numbers on that 9-6 ATS on a 5-game straight up win streak in the Super Bowl when they're dogs, do you?
Obviously I have the answer because I could usually find the answer. I went into Bet Labs. I checked it out. So teams 5+ game winning streak entering the Super Bowl who actually end up as dogs in the game, 5-2 ATS. And that would be the Chiefs last year. Oh my God, the Chiefs the year before that. The Bucs were actually dogs to the Chiefs in the 2020-2021 season. So those 3 won, and then before that 2-2. But recently, it's been pretty good. I think the thing you would note is covering by 5.7 points per game. So probably some decent value on the streaking team when they're listed as the dog. But again, small sample size.
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to kind of get that sense of that because it's very rare that you would have a team that won 5 straight, made the Super Bowl, and was a dog.
Matt, a dog who won 5 straight, who just come off scoring 55 points, who haven't scored, who haven't been in a close game, and it's crazy.
Yeah, look, from a betting perspective, if the Eagles win this game, everyone's going to be like, of course they won this game. Like, they're way better. Like, why did I listen to all the stupid Mahomes narrative stuff? Exactly. The other thing I would say though is the only reason the Chiefs are not on this kind of a streak is because they tanked weeks 18, right? Is because they pulled starters versus the Broncos. However, presumably amongst those, that's why I want to check out the underdogs, is presumably they would have played other teams that didn't have to play their starters in week 18, in week 16, 17 either. And so there's probably in that sample a few that were like, yeah, they didn't play the last week of the season because they already gotten the 1 seed or 2 seed. Interesting stuff there. Okay. So this one is, this is going to test me. We're going to talk about my least favorite narratively discussed defensive coordinator in the league, Vic Fangio. But before we do that, I want to let you know, as we've been discussing, the stage is set for Super Bowl 59 and the many prop bets to come. And that means now is the perfect time to upgrade to an Action Pro subscription. You heard Evan just talk about looking stuff up in Bet Labs. You get Bet Labs with an Action Pro subscription. Only Action Pro subscribers get real-time pick alerts from our experts like Super Bowl prop masters Sean Kerner and Chris Raybon. You've got to jump on them quick, guys. If you want to get the value, you got to get them right when they come out. Plus, all the tools you need to turn a profit betting in 2025. Right now, new customers can get $40 off a year of Action Pro at actionnetwork.com/SB. That's $40 off for the full year, so you'll be covered for the Super Bowl, March Madness, baseball, NBA, and even next college football and NFL season. So don't wait. Visit actionnetwork.com/SB to get $40 off Action Pro. All right, Evan, let's talk about Vic Fangio versus Patrick Mahomes.
All right. This to me is kind of gray. I see the white side. I see the black side of it. I think there's a little bit of both sides of this conversation, but I will just present what I've found, and then you and I can kind of dissect a little bit. So Fangio coach defenses have faced Mahomes 8 times, 6 with the Broncos and twice with the Dolphins. Mahomes is 8-0 straight up and 6-2 against the spread in those 8 games. Mahomes has thrown 10 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 64% completion percentage. So that is mostly the positive side of this. But I think there's a negative side. And even when you start to think about, 10 touchdown passes in 8 games isn't exactly lighting the world on fire. But I think there's just a few bullets here. So 2 of Mahomes' 10 lowest passing yard games in the regular season have actually come against a Fangio defense. Now, granted, there's a huge asterisk here. Denver's offense scored 15 total points in those 2 games. So Mahomes didn't even play the entire time of one of them. Most of them are KC blowouts, but not really making Mahomes do a ton. So let me just keep going here, and then you can give your thoughts. Pass yards after the catch. He's had his first and fourth lowest career games in the regular season, both against Fangio defenses, which means some good tackling out there on the outsides. Bad throw percentage, which is percent of off-target throws per attempt. Mahomes has had 21 of those games at 23% or higher in his career. 3 have come versus Fangio. Mahomes has also had 20 negative EPA games in his career. 2 have come versus Fangio defenses, and 2 of the top 10 worst EPA games too against those defenses. And then finally, 6 of the 8 games versus Fangio, Mahomes 20% or higher pressure percentage, which is basically times pressured per dropback. So, and the one note I will say as well, when the Chiefs faced Miami most recently, especially in the playoff game, Fangio was giving him some different stuff. There's some cover zero. There's blitzing at odd times. I think he's trying his best, especially in the games he feels outmatched, which I think we could talk about this one. I'm not sure he's going to feel the same way maybe in this one. So maybe the game plan's a little different. And you also can't play cover zero the entire game. It's more of a scheme thing to do. I just think the numbers are 8-0. It's great. Mahomes wins a ton of damn games. We know that. But I think inside the numbers, Fangio's creative. And I think especially with this defense, he's going to give him his best. But then I come back to that 23-3 against, good pass defense stat. Like Mahomes always figures it out as well. I just think this is going to be a fantastic chess match and something I'll want to, look over a ton of times.
I'm also going to make a correction here. Fangio. Okay. I'll just say this. It's not a correction. What I will say here is the Denver games were 6 of these 8, right?
Yeah.
And I believe Fangio was brought on as a consultant for the 2022 Eagles. I want to say that was
okay.
True. 6 of them were versus the Broncos, right? Versus the Chiefs.
Mm-hmm.
In those games, you did not have to score 24 points to beat them. If you got to 20, this is what I was like screaming bloody murder about for years with how everyone would jump on the Broncos over every year. And it's not just because I'm a hater, though I am a card carrying, certified, professionally graded Broncos hater living in Colorado. But it's that legitimately offenses would tailor themselves, and the Chiefs in particular would just pull the most vanilla stuff because it was like, guys, if we score 3 touchdowns, this game is over. They can't score 20 points. And so they played hyper conservative, which I do think factors into Fangio's overall success. But you're right that he is creative and that he's better equipped this time than ever, right? To be able to be like, look, if he can play too high, generate pressure with the front four, and then just mix in one extra rusher every now and again versus a compromised Chiefs offensive line, like there's absolutely a formula here for them to give him a miserable day. Like like the Bucs Super Bowl is not a bad comparison here.
Yeah.
Like it's just not. It's not a bad comp. And so I think that there's elements in here. I think the numbers are like a lot of the numbers are like, yeah, like sometimes Mahomes has bad games and sometimes they've come against Fangio. I am unwilling to give him like the conversation about him was I think overstated, but I think it's also like this isn't like a night. The bigger thing here I think is if you're adding up reasons to shoot the moon and try and take a shot on the Eagles, which by the way they're only a 1.5 point dog. But if you're trying to like actually bet against Mahomes, like that does play part of it, which is you don't have to feel bad about Fangio as a defensive coordinator. I think despite that 0-8 straight up record, he wasn't in a position to like they weren't on the same class level in Miami or in Denver, and this is the first time he's had that opportunity.
I think the two stats I take out of it, the bad throw percentage I think is interesting. 21 games, 23% or higher, 3 versus Fangio. And that leads to the last one, which I think is kind of interesting, which is the 6 of 8 games versus Fangio, 20% pressure percentage. I think the two correlate with each other. I think not running the blitz, getting as many people in his face as possible while not putting the extra pass rusher there will be vital in trying to get him kind of scrambling around and possibly making a mistake. So that's what I've got there. You want to go to the last one?
Yeah, one more, and it's about the guy I think that everybody's got the biggest questions about going into this matchup, despite a pretty good week last week.
Yeah, I don't even think this is a crazy trend because it's one we've been talking about and we've seen everywhere. But I do think it's like mildly important in terms of the handicap. And we had mentioned this earlier about, when we talked about the rushing stat with Barkley, the fact that Sirianni and Hurts have been here before. Well, Hurts is the first quarterback since Jim Kelly in 91 to make it to a second Super Bowl after losing his first. So that's 19 quarterbacks who haven't been able to do it. Now, it's been 34 years since a quarterback has had a second chance at winning the big one again after the loss. So just crazy to think about, honestly, going through one by one, how many couldn't get back. Now, obviously, we're in the middle of a bunch of these careers. Like Burrow lost his first. We have to see if he gets back there. So I think there's lots of chances we could see this again, but Hurts right now breaks the streak. So I do look at second Super Bowl appearance as kind of an interesting handicapping angle because I think we always talk about first experience is a little bit strange for people with the media, the 2 weeks. Like there's just a lot different about this game. So obviously Philly's been through it before and forget being through it before. I mean, they've played really well in the game. So maybe there is some things that we'll hear through quotes in the press that Sirianni will do differently, but been through the whole process here. So 3 quarterbacks have won it all in their second career Super Bowl when facing a quarterback with more experience in the game. So that's 2012 Eli over Brady. 2009 Roethlisberger beat Kurt Warner, who had been there one more time than him. And then 1994 Aikman beats Jim Kelly, who was there 75,000 times. Only Eli of that bunch was actually an underdog, which is where Hurts finds himself here. So, does it mean a ton? I don't think there's in that stat a handicap. I think the handicap is how much does this help or hurt? I think it helps Hurts being there, having done it before. And now, he's an underdog in the game. So, if you think he's going to win, you could even grab a point or two there. I do think it means something.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I do think that's the facing the same team. I think is the problem, right? Where it's like
okay,
you lost to him because we saw.
Wait, you think it helps or hurts?
I think it hurts.
Oh wow, okay.
I think it hurts him a little bit. I think the media side is like a huge advantage of not being overwhelmed by the absolute psychotic circus that is Super Bowl media week, and the like all the events and all the corporate partners and just like the absolute chaos that entails. Being able to just like, all right, I know how to handle this. I know what to say no to. We can get through this. It'll be fine. And like knowing what to expect going in, I think that does help for sure. I think on the other side of it is, I was here, we had a lead, I couldn't get it done. I have to do this again versus them. That to me, I think it's like a weird mental edge if you're building a narrative. But I think just from a comfort perspective, which I think is, if we're talking about home field advantage, right? Like that's the whole thing, is you get to sleep in your bed. There's less travel.
Sure.
I think going through it before is definitely an advantage here.
Yeah, and I would also say the crazy thing about it is that you watch these Super Bowls again, and like you watch back Chiefs Eagles, and you say to yourself, well, they're doing the exact same thing. How much is KC actually going to be taking anything old into this game plan? Because, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but like they bring out all these new packages, especially against Buffalo. Buffalo's watching all this tape and then getting to the game and saying to themselves, we haven't seen any of this. I mean, this is brand new, and this is, you know, the design run by Mahomes. Like all these things, they're preparing for the matchup. I just don't think KC's a real let's bring something back type team, which I do think makes this a little bit more difficult. But nonetheless, I think I kind of like the fact that it's a rematch matchup, and there's also parts we can go back to kind of learn, but also realizing that KC's just going to look at this kind of independently, which is kind of fascinating.
Eagles were 4th in defensive EPA the year they made the Super Bowl. They are 3rd this year.
Same team, kind
they
of.
They are 6th this year after being, I believe, top 5 when they made it the year in 2000. Yeah, they were 3rd in 2022. This to me is like what a lot of this crux comes down to is, do you believe that this Eagles team is substantially better? Not only, like, one of the ways I've actually kind of looked at it is this Eagles team better than the Niners team that the Chiefs faced last year? And you can say no, but, and so then the question is this Chiefs team better or worse than last year's? And I think both of those are fair questions. On paper, I think it's hard to argue that the Chiefs, who actually have receivers with actual like opposable thumbs, is worse than last year's. But I think that's like a key question in trying to navigate all this. But the trends are fascinating. I will ask you this question, Evan, and you don't have to give a pick here, but with all, but you do the trends work, and it's such a great job that you do. Based on the historical trends, does this line feel right to you?
It definitely does, but I think we've talked about it a bunch of times during this pod at different areas. I think the Mahomes, it's Mahomes against the Eagles. It doesn't feel like the Chiefs versus the Eagles, because if it was Chiefs versus Eagles, the Eagles would be favored.
Yeah.
And that to me, and that's why I start out this week doing all this research, kind of feeling like, who do I personally like in the game? Like the trends are a few percentage points to me of the puzzle. There's a lot other things, like we talked about the Fangio, and there's a lot of things to kind of dissect here. It's gonna be hard for me to avoid, after I took the Chiefs in the AFC Championship game and I like them against Buffalo. It's gonna be hard for me to avoid Philly here. I think they're better. So,
yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting. I think one thing that I think is very notable in these things is we talked about the Saquon factor, right, and all those trends and his incredible season and how good that offense was last week. A lot of it is, when we talk about the inexplicable nature of the Chiefs' wins, a great one is like, why do teams stop running against them? Why do teams not just commit to the run? This is what killed Stuckey last year in the Ravens in the AFC Championship game, was like, if you just run the ball, you can run on them. And they just didn't. And then last week is another great example of this. Josh Allen comes out, and on that first drive, they're slinging. Like, you're trying to pass on. When they settled down and they were running, that's when they got back into the game and had a chance to win. So a lot of it's just like, do you think, for me, you talked about Mahomes versus the Eagles and these kind of things. For me, it very much is, it's Saquon, Hurts, and Sirianni versus Reed and Mahomes.
My feeling with Saquon is kind of simple, though. His over-under for carries is 22.5. If that over hits, I think Philly wins. Like 22.5 is a lot of carries. That's a big projection. But to me, if they do the right thing and give him the ball and give him the opportunities, you're also most likely going to bleed more clock on the other side, give Mahomes kind of, less opportunities. So I feel like that is a little correlated. Now, obviously, you run the ball more when you have the lead. Yep. The one thing we also haven't seen is Philly play from behind a ton, which would put a lot of pressure on Hurts, which, other than the Washington game, has looked pretty poor in a lot of these different circumstances. So at one point, someone's going to be behind in this one. Obviously, we feel really good about Kansas City when they're behind. I think Philly's the bigger question.
For sure. It's going to be great. Do you want to bet? You want to bet against Mahomes and then have to deal with it if you're wrong? Or do you want to miss a great chance maybe to finally be on the right side in fading Mahomes? All right, that'll do it here on the Action Network podcast for the 2025 Super Bowl Gambling Guide. I'm Matt Moore. Thanks to Evan for joining me today. Don't forget to download the free award-winning Action Network app to see more from all of our Action Network contributors, plus our live shows, and you can track your own picks. Check out the free Action Network Discord server to chop it up with experts like Sean Kerner and fellow gamblers before, after, and during games for any sport. Just visit discord.gg/Action Network or follow the link in the podcast episode description. Remember to mark your calendars. Super Bowl props live shows this Wednesday and next Wednesday. This Wednesday at 4 and next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern on the Action Network YouTube page at youtube.com/The Action Network and at Action Network HQ on Twitter. Enjoy the lead up to the Super Bowl and good luck with all your bets. We'll see you guys again next time on the Action Network podcast.